Young children at a Texas daycare were allegedly subjected to repeated abuse by a woman who was supposed to be taking care of them. Authorities say she assaulted the children more than 130 times over the last several months. We are going to dig into how something like this could even happen, the charges she faces, and the potential consequences, all with a daycare and child injury attorney. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. All right, let's talk about 44-year-old Catherine Guziejka, who's currently behind bars in Smith County, Texas, because she is accused of kicking toddlers in her care at Pumpkin Doodle's Daycare. And it was apparently all caught on surveillance footage. Yeah. So Guziejka, who was booked into the Smith County Jail on October 30th on 6 counts of injury to a child with the intent to cause bodily harm. She's still in custody. Those are very serious felony charges, and we're going to talk about that. But according to deputies, the way this all started was there was apparently a staffer at the daycare center who came across this surveillance video in October that showed some of these incidents. So the staffer then apparently notifies the father of one of the victims, who then calls the police. Investigators come over, they look over the surveillance video from inside the daycare, and they find that Guziejka allegedly kicked 6 toddlers on 134 separate occasions. 134. All the alleged victims apparently were just 2 years old. This allegedly been going on for months. I want to talk about this right now, and I want to bring in Russell Button, a daycare and child injury attorney in Texas, who unfortunately, we've had him on before, not because we don't like you, Russell, but because these are the things we're talking about. What are your initial impressions on this story?
First off, Jesse, what happened to these innocent kids at Pumpkin Doodle's Daycare is horrific. I mean, it is just heartbreaking when we first learned that this abuse had been going on for so long and happened so often to multiple children. Thankfully, the individual caregiver is in jail and will never be allowed to work with kids in Texas again. But this entire situation is a reminder to parents across the nation. Child abuse and neglect is happening, and it is happening at daycares that we trust our children to care for.
And I will tell you that apparently this video evidence is showing these incidents happened since July, and several of the videos show a child watching TV when Guziejka allegedly just kicks them in the back. Several videos reportedly show Guziejka walking around during nap time for the kids and then aggressively moving various toddlers around, even pulling some of them from their beds, dragging them by their arms to a changing table. This is all according to court documents. And in videos that apparently show a changing table, Guziejka reportedly put the children on the table quite aggressively, pushing their heads, forcing them to stare at the wall instead of in the direction of a TV. And she's even accused of standing on the toddler's hands as a form of punishment. There's even apparently one video of her allegedly standing on a child's hand for several seconds as they're trying to pull their hand away. Now, deputies who looked at the video said that the children, they weren't being disruptive. They weren't doing anything that would even require discipline, let alone discipline like this. Now, the sheriff's office said in the affidavit that it, quote, was apparent that Guziejka's actions were random, intentional, unprovoked, violent in nature, and done for the sole intent of inflicting pain. Russell, that is very important language and a very important description. What do you take away from that?
You know, when I hear that and when we see these types of things happening, the most alarming thing is, how did this go on for so long? What sort of culture was in place that the other caregivers either allowed this to happen and didn't say anything, the director and owner allowed this to happen and didn't say anything, because the degree of what you're describing and what we've seen happened here is just so horrific and alarming for such a long period of time. There absolutely should be these criminal charges being brought, and to the fullest extent of the law. And thankfully, that is happening. Local law enforcement is actively investigating. They're still going through this footage, Jesse, like you're talking about. They've started by bringing 6 felony charges.
Can we talk about those charges? So these are, my understanding, very serious charges, first-degree felonies. And under Texas law, does that carry 5 to 99 years in prison? Am I right about that?
Honestly, I'm not the criminal defense attorney
Yeah.
to know what the sentencing requirements are, but I can tell you from all of our daycare injury cases where we've helped guide these families through that process, as far as what the court can do per charge is according to the sentencing guidelines for these exact felonies. And there is jail time. Absolutely. And we hope that this court and this DA does not let this lady off the hook and does not take it lightly, because this needs to send a message. That this is unacceptable for a caregiver to even put themselves in that position, and a daycare for allowing it to happen. These things need to be brought to light. Now, there's 6 charges right now. They're still going through this footage. There may be more coming. This is what we know right now. And that's just the criminal justice system, right? That's the criminal pathway that these families have for some justice through the criminal system. There's also the state licensing and the civil pathway of a civil lawsuit that these families have as recourse against this daycare to hold them accountable, to bring awareness to this and make sure it doesn't happen again.
I want to talk about that. I want to say really quickly, thank you for coming to us here on Sidebar for this story. I know it's not an easy one to hear. It's a distressing one to hear, but we really appreciate it. And also, I have to thank our partner, Morgan & Morgan, for sponsoring this episode. It helps us make these shows possible. And here is the thing. If you should get injured, America's largest injury law firm, Morgan & Morgan, may be who you want in your corner. Aside from the fact that there's no upfront fee, aside from the fact that the whole process from beginning to end can be done right from your smartphone, Morgan & Morgan has an incredible track record, like recent verdicts of $12 million in Florida and $26 million in Philadelphia, and these are higher than the highest insurance offers in these cases. And look, even if your case isn't worth millions of dollars, Morgan & Morgan will fight for what you deserve. So if you're injured, you can easily start a claim at forthepeople.com/LC Sidebar. I do want to go back to this other idea of, in your experience, whether it's a criminal case or a civil case, if there's someone's being sued over this, are there any defenses? I mean, what would be a defense? It's one thing to say, a parent came forward and made an accusation against the caregiver that they were being abused, and then you have a back and forth with the caregiver saying, no, the child injured themselves because they fell off the table or they were playing. When it's caught on surveillance footage, what is a possible defense, if any?
There's no defense to this. There is no excuse for child abuse. I mean, that is crystal clear. And what we know here, as far as the civil case and what defense could be brought, what they say and how they get attacked, these families have legitimate causes of action against punkadoodles, okay? The daycare is responsible for hiring this employee. So on their application, what's going to be their prior history? What sort of reasons was this person qualified? Because we know they weren't. Making sure they were qualified, training her, supervising her. There was no supervision, because this wouldn't have been able to happen this often to this many kids for that long of a period of time had this caregiver been properly supervised by anybody to make sure that they were doing their job the right way. So we know punkadoodles failed in that. There is no defense to this. What they try to do is they try to say, hey, it was a one-time isolated incident in these daycare abuse cases. No way we could have seen this coming. But this was not a one-time incident. This was repeated, systematic, routine abuse by this caregiver. And the history of this daycare alone, which is available to the public online, shows that as recently as of July of 2024 of this year, Punkadoodles was issued a citation from the state licensing department for its failure to have the required written policies and procedures on preventing and responding to child abuse and neglect. Think about that for a moment. That is unbelievable. And that begs the question, were these caregivers even trained on how to prevent and respond to child abuse? All of the caregivers.
Can I ask you a question? What do you mean? Like there has to be a bulletin in the daycare, that like a poster, if you observe child abuse, this is what you do? Or is it something that they're trained on separately when they're hired? What do you mean that what's required of them?
Well, there's state laws for these daycare facilities that they're required to have policies and procedures. They have to have qualified, trained, and supervised caregivers through a whole litany of different aspects. One of the big high-level severity issues that we see in these cases, which we've been on your show before talking about, and we're doing here today, is daycare abuse, right? Child abuse. And so they're supposed to have policies and procedures. These caregivers are supposed to undergo routine and frequent training on preventing and responding to child abuse. So how to prevent it from yourself. It could be an emotional type training. But these daycares are supposed to have policies and procedures on it. They're supposed to qualify their employees on it to see if somebody has something on their background that would lead them to doing these things, because this doesn't just happen if people love kids and love working at daycare. And then these other caregivers and the director has to be trained on responding and preventing child abuse, what symptoms to look out for, what red flags to look for. And this caregiver in this case had been working at this daycare since September of 2023.
That's right.
Which is long before this state issued that citation that the daycare itself had to put policies and procedures in place. What we don't know, and what needs to be discovered for these families that they need these answers to, is how many employees came through this daycare and didn't receive required instructions on how to prevent and respond to child abuse. That is what this civil case is going to all be about.
Right.
And there is no defense to that.
And to be clear, I haven't seen it, but there's no lawsuit that's filed as of yet. But you're suggesting that it's only, what, a matter of time?
It should be. I mean, we hope that when something traumatic happens to a child at a daycare, that it's not just reported to the police and to the state, but they're actually held accountable civilly, because the criminal system is just punishing the individual, right?
Sure.
And that's just that justice, and that's a very important form of justice. State licensing, they're looking at it from administrative violations, right? And so that's one form from an administrative standpoint. But with what happens to the child, what happens to accountability for negligence, that has to be done through the civil aspect. And so while I'm not aware that there are any lawsuits or any attorneys that have been retained for this yet, there absolutely could and should be one here to hold them accountable and make sure to expose this and bring a bigger light to it. In that small of a town and that small of a community, this should never happen. And if something's not done about it, it's going to open up a door that, hey, this is going to be okay and acceptable behavior, which it is absolutely not.
Talking about the daycare's owner, who has been identified as Melanie Dawn Law, she came out and said she immediately fired this woman when the alleged abuse was exposed, called the police, also called the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services, and the agency, as you alluded to, determined that Guziejka can no longer work at any daycare, hospital, nursing home, any facility that cares essentially for vulnerable people. That response, you would say, I imagine, is adequate. It's just what happened before, right? It's that she didn't do enough to monitor her employee. One of the questions that I've had is, in your experience, are daycare owners, employees, are they supposed to review the footage every day? How often do they review surveillance footage?
That's one of the big things in our cases, right? Our big warning to parents looking for safe daycares is, hey, when you go there, make sure that daycare doesn't just have video cameras with live feed footage, but actually has recorded footage. And here's why. These daycares absolutely should be reviewing the footage routinely, frequently, and often when they see things that are happening. They need to be bringing light to it. That's how they need to be doing their training. And far too often, they have these elaborate systems and video surveillance systems, but they don't do anything with them. And what good is that? If these caregivers feel the freedom to be able to do these types of atrocious acts to children, to little kids, innocent kids, and they know they're being recorded and they know that they're on camera, then what does that tell you about the other types of culture that's at that daycare and the system, that they're that open to being able to do this on camera and not be for a fear of retribution by the daycare owner? So should this daycare director have called the police and the state, and did they take actions when they first claimed they learned about it? Sure, absolutely. That's what we expect them to do, and we hope that they do. But what happened in the months and months and months before this, when all this was going on and the police are going through this footage saying, we haven't gotten through it all yet? I mean, this is just alarming.
Let me ask you this. I had mentioned that the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services were called by this owner. They made a determination about Guziejka. But what role do they play now in this investigation? What do they do next?
So DFPS is part of the state agency. They're going to come in from the state of Texas. They're going to investigate this daycare. They're going to take a look at abuse, neglect, and lack of supervision, okay, for every different aspect of what could have happened to these children based off of the state minimum standard laws. And then they're going to put out those findings and violations that is public record out there. So it's one of the three different functions that happens when a child is injured at a daycare facility like this and abused. You have the criminal case, you have the civil case, and then you have the state licensing investigation. So it's a critical component. They'll send an investigator out there. They'll talk with the different families. They'll review footage. They'll review records and documents, and then they'll compare it to the state standards with the law, and they'll come up with a list of violations, and they'll have a report with it.
Let me ask you this, if this complicates it at all. The owner of this daycare, Ms. Law, who I mentioned before, she spoke with Texas news outlet KSLA and told them that she has sold the daycare to a new owner. They're going to be reopening it this month under a new name. Does that complicate anything?
Not at all. Even though this owner, who was also the director of the daycare, sold the daycare when all this came to light, Pumpkin Doodles can and should still be held accountable for its failures. They can't just escape justice by simply selling off the company. You know, we see people try to do that. That's not the way it works. Consulting with an experienced daycare and child injury lawyer like our team, that's what we do. We have experiences in cases like this where an owner or a daycare owner closed down the daycare, even if they didn't try to sell it off. That is not a way to escape justice as well. They can't get away with it. There's things in place for that. There's also insurance coverage that's in place for these things. That doesn't just simply go away because you sold the company or closed down your daycare.
All right. Well, let's see what happens. I'll tell you, Guziejka currently behind bars, reportedly on a $450,000 bond. No word yet on when she'll be back in court, but we'll see. Just another horrifying case of alleged child abuse that we're seeing in these daycares. But Russell, really, thank you so much. Russell Button, really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you, Jesse. Appreciate you.
All right, everybody, that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. Speak to you next time.